I'm Elizabeth Newton, President of the Queens County Women's Bar Association. Welcome everyone this evening. The Queens County Women's Bar Association is proud to present this program, Our Vote, Our Power, a candid discussion about the women's suffrage movement. Before we get started, I just want to share a little story with you. Someone once asked me, what did I think, or how did I feel about the 19th Amendment? And what I said is that, what does it mean to me? It means unity. It means standing together, no matter what we look like, where we come from. We must unite together for justice. Women from diverse groups united together to fight for the right to vote. They were Black, they were Latinx, they were Indigenous, they were immigrants, queer, and white. They were tireless organizers, tenacious fighters, political geniuses. Together, they won the right to vote, which laid the foundation, the cornerstone, to vote for gender equality in the United States. So that's what the 19th Amendment means to me: standing together, fighting together, and winning. I'd like to introduce our speakers. Tonight we have Laura Ladd-Bierman, Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of the State of New York, and Erica Smitka, Legislative Director of the League of Women Voters of the State of New York. Laura will discuss the history of women's suffrage movement, and Erica will present where we are now in pending legislation. Before I turn it over to Laura and Erica, a few housekeeping issues. Please mute your mics during this presentation. And any questions that you have, please place them in the chat. We are monitoring the chat and they will be addressed at the end of the program. Thank you and enjoy this program. You're going to have fun. Laura, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And good evening to everyone. Thank you for the Queens Women's Bar Association for inviting us to do this program. We really appreciate that. We love to get our word out as much as we can. For those of you who don't know us, and I saw the list of who's in attendance, and there are a lot of League members there, so great, and I'm always love to see you all. The League is a nonpartisan voter education and advocacy organization. Our mission is to inform and engage our community in the political process. It is a 3-level organization with 45 local leagues in New York State and over 700 leagues nationwide. Our 45 local leagues and around 4,000 grassroots members hold voter registration drives, candidate debates, and community forums to educate the public about current policy. Recently, our forums have also included historical presentations outlining the history of the League and women winning the right to vote. Before I start the presentation, I just want to let everyone know I am not a historian, and this is not a lecture. The purpose of my presentation is to tell the story of women winning the right to vote in New York State. And I will say that the League has been very active in kind of researching this and presenting this over the last few years. And that's how I've learned this history as well.
You want me to leave it so you can hear it, or I'll just put my ear?
So what's a story without pictures? This slideshow is a collection of photos that we've amassed over the last few years from both the Library of Congress and the League's own files. We hope you enjoy them, and we hope they inspire you to look ahead for what's in store for women over the next 100 years. With that, I take you first to Seneca Falls in the mid-1800s. They say it started as a tea party. A group of women gathered to discuss issues of the day in 1848. Jane Hunt, an activist and woman about town, became the catalyst for the women's rights movement. Jane invited Lucretia Mott, Martha Wright, Mary Ann McClintock, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton to have tea and discuss the misfortunes imposed upon women. Although these women were by no means poor or unfortunate, they recognized the burden put upon their fellow women as a result of not having the power to vote. Oops, sorry. Not having the power within their own government, not having voting rights, and not being able to own their own property. By the end of this Tea Party, the 5 women organized the first women's rights convention set for Seneca Falls, New York, and wrote a notice for the Seneca County Courier that invited all women to attend this influential event. In July of 1848, more than 300 people assembled in Seneca Falls for the nation's first women's rights convention. It still amazes me always that so many people knew to come to Seneca Falls at this time without Facebook, without Instagram, or any other electronic way to spread the word. They just all knew to come to Seneca Falls. The meeting took place at the quaint Wesleyan Chapel, and the chapel still stands. And if you get a chance to visit, it is really interesting. It is now a national park, and the rangers will go in and they will describe the setting, the surroundings, while you sit there, and you can just feel what was happening in 1848. The church was a tiny church, and the women were all wearing wool dresses and petticoats, and this is the middle of July, and there was no air conditioning. So you can imagine it wasn't the most comfortable setting. But at this meeting, Elizabeth Cady Stanton read her now famous Declaration of Sentiments, protesting women's inferior legal status and listing 11 resolutions for the moral, economic, and political equality of women, the most radical of which demanded the elective enfranchisement. The document was modeled after the Declaration of Independence and was signed by 68 women and 32 men. 100 of the people of the 300 who were in attendance. Notably, Frederick Douglass was a co-author of the document and signer. He dedicated his life to both abolition and women's suffrage, attending and speaking at conventions, writing in books, newspapers, and advocating for the enfranchisement of both women and African Americans. The U.S. women's rights movement was closely allied with the anti-slavery movement, and before the Civil War, Black and white abolitionists and suffragists joined together in common cause. During the antebellum period, a small cohort of formerly enslaved and free Black women, including Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Maria W. Stewart, Henrietta Purvis, Sarah Redmond, and Mary Ann Shadd Cary were active in the women's rights circles. They were joined in their advocacy of women's rights and suffrage by prominent Black men, including Frederick Douglass, Charles Lennox Remond, and Robert Purvis. And they worked in collaboration with white abolitionists and women's rights activists. Following the 1848 Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, prominent free Black women abolitionists and suffragists attended, spoke, and assumed leadership positions at multiple women's rights gatherings throughout the 1850s and the 1860s. In 1851, former slave Sojourner Truth delivered her famous Ain't I a Woman speech at the National Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio. Sarah Redmond and her brother Charles won wide acclaim for their pro-women suffrage speeches at the 1858 National Women's Rights Convention in New York City. Now's the part where I have to tell you about the villain. And unfortunately, in the case of suffrage, the hero and the villain are one and the same. Controversy surrounded the women's suffrage efforts during the 1800s because of race. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony worked together with white Southerners and opposed ratification of the 15th Amendment that would guarantee the vote to Black men. The opposition came following a heated disagreement among the women and Douglass over who should vote first. Hang on one second. My dog's barking if you can't hear it. Sorry. Douglas rightly pointed out that African Americans were in a much worse state than women, and that the vote would do far more in securing their freedom. At the Equal Rights Association meeting in 1869, Douglas made his final plea. He said, when women, because they are women, are dragged from their homes and hung upon lampposts, when their children are torn from their arms and their brains dashed upon the pavement, when they are objects of insult and outrage at every turn, when they are in danger of having their homes burnt down over their heads, when their children are not allowed to enter schools, then they will have the same urgency to obtain the ballot. As powerful as those words were, they were lost upon many of the suffragists who felt that they deserved the vote first. Lucy Stone, a prominent Massachusetts suffragist, agreed with Douglas and broke away from Stanton and Anthony to form the American Women's Suffrage Association to fight for universal suffrage in the Constitution. Anthony and Stanton continued to use any rhetoric necessary to support their cause through the National Women's Suffrage Association. In spite of the anti-Black rhetoric within the suffrage movement, Black women attended and spoke out at political and religious meetings and public rallies. They remained politically engaged in spite of the external backlash they received. Notable suffragists included Frances Harper, an abolitionist, suffragist, poet, teacher, public speaker, and writer, one of the first African-American women to be published in the United States. Ida B. Wells, an American investigative journalist, educator, and an early leader in the civil rights movement. She was one of the founders of the NAACP. And Mary Church Terrell, one of the first African-American women to earn a college degree. She became known as a national activist for civil rights and suffrage and taught at one of the first African-American public high schools in the nation and founded the National Association for Colored Women. The 15th Amendment would pass in 1870, and over time, tensions between Stanton, Anthony, and Douglas subsided. Eventually, the two suffrage associations would once again merge to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association. That organization would later become the League of Women Voters, but we'll get to that soon enough. Our story has an happy ending for some, but not for all. And again, we'll get to more of that in a little bit too. I want to now look a little bit at New York State, because in October of 1915, over 25,000 women marched up Fifth Avenue in New York City to advocate for women's suffrage. At that point, the fight had been going on for more than 65 years. And in spite of their efforts, the women's suffrage amendment to the New York State Constitution did not pass in 1915. The amendment was voted down by a margin of 200,000 male voters. The question was posed to the men again in 1917. This time, the women's suffrage amendment was passed when 700,000 men voted yes and 600,000 voted no. In November of 1917, New York women won the right to vote. 3 years later, in August of 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified, giving all women in the United States the right to vote. Well, not all women, but first let's look at more history of women and voting. So first, wait a minute, we missed one. Sorry. Okay, this is just a slide that gives you a couple of statistics. That the Wyoming Territory granted women's suffrage in 1869, and Jeanette Rankin of Montana was the first American woman elected to Congress in 1916. In 1915, as I said, the New York State Amendment failed, but in 1917 it passed. And when it passed, in New York was the first state to pass women's suffrage east of the Mississippi River. The 19th Amendment, which reads, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." This amendment passed the House in May 21st, 1919, passed the Senate June 4th, 1919. By March of 1920, a total of 35 states had approved the amendment, one vote shy of the 2/3 of ratification. On August 19th, 1920, Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the amendment. And there's an interesting story on about Tennessee ratifying that. There was a one legislator, a Mr. Burns, who they thought was going to oppose the amendment, but he had a note from his mother, Mrs. Burns, who wrote to her son, "Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat put the rat in ratification." With that, Mr. Burns voted yes, and the 19th Amendment was fully ratified. There's a great book called The Woman's Hour, The Great Fight to Win the Vote, by Elaine Weiss, that summarizes these last 2 months in Tennessee. It has a lot of personalities, and it's an interesting read. And she was a speaker at one of our state conventions recently. It's very interesting to hear about the last fights in Tennessee. It took over 60 years for the remaining 12 states to ratify the 19th Amendment. Mississippi was the last to do so on March 22nd, 1984. So not that long ago. So now let's look why not all women were allowed to vote, even following certification of the 19th Amendment. Although technically enfranchised, state governments put many barriers in the way African Americans would seek to vote. Poll taxes, unnecessary testing, and lines up to 12 hours long stood in the way of African Americans being enfranchised. Even today, states try to do whatever they can to prevent certain populations of voters from exercising their right to vote. It wasn't until passage in 1965 of the National Voting Rights Act that discriminatory voting practices were outlawed. That act has since been gutted following the federal court decision of Shelby v. Holder, which addressed the constitutionality of 2 provisions of the Voting Rights Act. Section 5 required states and local governments to attain federal pre-clearance before implementing voting laws or practices. And Section 4B contained the formula to determine which jurisdictions are subject to pre-clearance based on their voting discrimination history. Litigation continues on many of the voter suppression efforts all around the states, and the leagues are involved in many states fighting voter ID laws, documentary proof of citizenship, redistricting, election protection, and voter purges. So the fight is not over yet. The League worked in the 60s to support passage of the Voting Rights Act, and it's continuing to work on these sections. Here in New York State, the legislature has passed a New York State Voting Rights Act that will fill in some of the gaps of the federal rollback. Our advocacy work is a major part of our mission, but the League is truly an education organization whose main goal is to ensure all voters know about their right to vote, about the candidates and offices they are voting for. The League was created directly out of the National American Women's Suffrage Association of 1919, with the intention of educating women so they wouldn't have to listen to their husbands or fathers when they went to vote. In the beginning, the League helped women run for office and advocate for expanded rights for all. So originally, the League was founded to educate women on how to vote and what was on their ballot. I like to say that that is still our mission and our goal. However, it's not just for women, it's for all people now. That is a goal of ours, to make sure that everyone has accessibility to vote and knows and is an informed voter. So the goal has not changed. It's been expanded for all people now. Now I am going to turn it over to Erica, who is going to talk about now what the league is working on and some of the issues that we're dealing with there. So Erica?
Great, thank you so much, Laura. I think you can click through. I think the title of this slide should pop up. But if not, it'll shoot us to the next slide. Here we go. All right, thank you, Laura. So I first want to start off by talking about something that I think uniquely ties both the women's suffrage movement and where we are today together. The women's suffrage movement is often romanticized, when in reality it was incredibly arduous and incredibly difficult, much like the COVID pandemic was in very, very recent years, and we're still in it. But in 1918, America saw another pandemic. The Spanish flu hit America. The flu overtook the nation when women had already gained momentum for a constitutional amendment to secure the right to vote. And so organizers were naturally concerned that this pandemic would slow down and really derail their progress towards earning the right to vote. And it did. It really did slow down the progress a bit. But women kept plugging on. They kept pushing, did even more activities to support the movement, including public speeches, rallies, donation collections. They still hosted events. They kept their attendance very limited. Some of the things I was reading, I was like, wow, this is very resonant with what we just went through here. And much like this pandemic that we went through in 1918, we went through something similar, and we saw women hit the hardest during the COVID-19 pandemic, and specifically women of color. Across the board, women lost more jobs, they were paid lower wages, they were evicted in higher numbers, but yet we still saw women and more women show up, both as league members and women across the country who provided leadership and service as election processes were adapted or reimagined. We saw that right here in New York State. We saw the number of poll worker volunteers dwindle due to the threat of COVID-19 exposure, but women saw that need and they showed up and they filled in. They kept the polls open for multiple days, supported mail-in ballot procedures, as well as absentee ballot collecting and counting. So I thought this was a unique tie to both events that I hadn't really thought of until I was doing some research for this presentation. So you can go to the next slide, Laura. Let's talk a little bit about where we are now. And as we look into the future, we still have a very long way to go. I was at an event this morning down in New York City with the governor, and she said that more than 300 voter suppression laws have been introduced in 45 states so far this year. That's in this year alone. And while New York is really starting to trend in the right direction, across the country, laws are continuing to restrict access to the ballot in many, many states. And unfortunately, we are seeing historically disenfranchised groups continue to be targeted and disenfranchised by these laws. So a few examples that I'd like to give. In Arkansas, North Dakota, and Ohio, they all approved legislation that would make it harder for citizens to initiate or pass ballot measures, which is one of the tools that we as citizens can use to really create some pretty big and effective change in our own government. Lawmakers in at least 5 other states have taken steps to create quote unquote election police units. So for example, in Arkansas again, they enacted a law that creates an election integrity unit in the Attorney General's office that's tasked with investigating violations of election law and referring them to prosecution. Violations of election law that we know are truly pretty rare and few and far between, but what we do see far more often is voter suppression by limiting people's access to the ballot for, these with laws just like this. Another example, in 2021 in Florida, there were restrictions put into place to restrict vote by mail efforts when we were still very much in the thick of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's worth it to note that just prior to 2021 and 2022, we saw Black voters in Florida voted by mail far more than they had in any previous election. So again, continuing to target groups that had previously been disenfranchised. The last one I'll mention is that Georgia gained, I'm sure many of you probably heard about this, Georgia gained national attention by making it a crime to distribute water or snacks to voters waiting in line, even though Georgia election lines are like famously incredibly long, and people were sitting for hours and hours just to get out and vote. And so that's a practice that many states have used to kind of curb voter participation and to encourage people to kind of give up. In New York State, actually, there is a bill that has not yet been passed or signed, but that would put into law that folks are allowed to bring snacks and food to people waiting in line to vote. So up until very recently, New York State was one of the worst states in the country for voting rights. And we're slowly fighting to turn back the tide and go from, as election chair Zellner Myrie would say, go from worst to first. And so we're slowly getting there. There was a number of really effective pieces of legislation passed in 2019, such as automatic voter registration, online voter registration. These are things that we're seeing finally start to roll out this year and probably into next year. We saw as Laura mentioned, the New York Voting Rights Act, which was one of the most historic and all-encompassing acts to combat voter suppression in the state of New York, and to help, as Laura said, fill in the gaps of the National Voting Rights Act. And lastly, we have been seeing a number of measures around disability rights and access to the polls. There was a recent study put out by the Brennan Center, which found that, I don't want to misquote here, it's 94 or 90, I think it's 94% of poll sites are not fully accessible to voters with disabilities, and that's in New York State. And that was a stat that I found pretty shocking. So even though we are we're making our way and taking steps forward, there's still a lot of work to be done here in New York. All right, we can jump into the next slide, actually, Laura, if you want to click through. So in addition to voting rights and voting access, women face countless other challenges. I'm only going to touch on just the ones that you see here today, because if I didn't, I'd be talking for hours. So we truly continue to fight for basic human rights for women all across our country. The first thing I'll talk about is pay equity. So Laura, you can hop to the next slide. As I'm sure we all unfortunately know, the gender wage gap persists. What we're actually finding is that the gender wage gap, we saw some pretty huge jumps in the 80s, where I believe white women were paid 64 cents to the dollar for men, and now in 2022 it rose to 80 or 82 cents per dollar, but it's really stayed pretty close to that level since then. And there's no single explanation for why progress towards narrowing that pay gap has really stalled in the 21st century. But what we're also finding is that women also generally begin their careers with closer wage parity to men, but as they age, they lose ground and that gap becomes wider. And that pattern is something that we've seen consistently throughout time. And that pay gap persists even though women today are more likely than men to have graduated from college. You go to the next slide, Laura. And as I'm sure we all unfortunately know, that this gap is even more extreme for women of color, especially for Latina women, Indigenous peoples, as well as Pacific Islanders, Black women. In America, that gap is even more significant. You go to the next slide, Laura. So the other challenge that we're facing, as I'm sure everybody heard, the Dobbs decision last summer, which shut down Roe v. Wade. And so now abortion access and access to a lot of really basic reproductive care is done on a state-by-state basis. So this map shows access in different states, and the deeper red the state is, the less access that state has. So in Texas, for example, there's no access to abortion for individuals who are pregnant, and in states that are white, there is still access. So you'll see New York is obviously still a white state, which is great. But states enacted a whopping 424 new abortion restrictions from 2010 to 2018 alone, and then an additional 58 in just the first half of 2019. So these are laws that have been enacted, not just laws that have been introduced and didn't pass or didn't even make it to a vote. These are laws that have actually been voted on and enacted. So I thought this map was pretty shocking to see it kind of as in a full picture. You go to the next slide, Laura. The other place in which women are constantly and consistently still fighting for our rights is for the Equal Rights Amendment. It's been over 100 years since Alice Paul first introduced the Equal Rights Amendment, which would include women in the Constitution for the United States. That is way too long for women to be seen as equal under the law, and we still are not seen as equal. And so while we continue to push for this law on the federal level, we also have the opportunity here in New York State to pass a New York State Equal Rights Amendment in 2024, which not only will put women in the New York State Constitution, but it will also protect a bunch of other classes that are currently not protected in our Constitution, including age discrimination, disability status, LGBTQIA folks, immigrants. The list is actually quite long and inclusive, which is great. And Laura, you can go to the next slide. So the last thing I want to talk about is women are still fighting for representation in politics. Across the country, women are still outnumbered in political roles with an average of 24% of women is the average. And that's over all types of varying political bodies across the country. Even though in 2020, we saw the highest voter participation in American history, and we saw more people of color elected to office, more Black women elected to office. However, even though we have 26 Black women currently in our U.S. House of Representatives, we do not have a single Black woman in our Senate, which is pretty shocking in the year 2023. Well, maybe shocking is the wrong word, but I think y'all understand what I'm getting at here. And so I also wanted to really highlight where New York stands. And New York, actually, in the grand scheme of things, we're not doing too bad. Certainly, this is how, all depends on the definition, right? But in New York State, we get a grade of a B from the organization Represent Women, which looks at women's representation in political positions. And one of the ways I like to think one of the ways that we did this is through small donor public financing, which has been active in New York City for many, many years and allows women to, or allows for an even more diverse set of folks to get elected. And my dog is now whining in the background. I don't know if you can hear me. For example, this past year, New York City elected its most diverse council body in history, which was fantastic. And that was all due to small donor public financing. So I'm sure that's not the only reason, but that's just one example of how New York State has helped to move forward when it comes to gender equity in when looking at political positions and representation in politics. And you go to the next slide, Laura. So the last thing I want to touch on is you all may have seen August 26th was Women's Equality Day. And the League has renamed this day Women's Inequality Day. It marks the anniversary of the certification of the 19th Amendment, which granted some women, as Laura talked about, some women the right to vote. And in 2022, after the Dobbs decision, the League decided this would be Women's Inequality Day to highlight the number of inequalities that women continue to face in our country. And touching on everything I just talked about, whether it be the rollback of reproductive freedom, the failure of Congress to pass voting rights legislation, or add the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution. We are seeing the impacts of these laws already. We're seeing, as I said, anti-voter laws passed that silence voters at the polls. We are seeing an Equal Rights Amendment that's still not ratified. And we're also seeing the impact of anti-abortion legislation on those who can become pregnant. And so the fight for women's equality has ultimately always been grounded in the right to vote. When some women have fewer rights and access, we can't call ourselves equal, and we cannot celebrate equality. So this past August and moving on into this fall, we and the League, we're standing together, demanding that our rights are restored, demanding to be heard, and demanding to be seen and treated as equals. Because together we really do have the power to create a more perfect and inclusive democracy that celebrates our diversity and welcomes each and every person to participate. And with that, I think that is my final slide. I will turn it back to Elizabeth.
Thank you, Erica, and thank you, Laura. Erica, if I may, can you talk more about the voting rights legislation that was signed today?
Absolutely. So today was a really exciting day. As I mentioned, we were down in New York City for an event with the governor where she signed a number of pieces of voting rights legislation for New York State, one of which is the Early Mail Voting Act, which has already been challenged in our court system. So I'm sure you'll be hearing a lot about that going into the next few weeks. Another is mandatory poll worker training, which is something that the League has worked a lot on this past session. Create equity for, all poll workers would be given more consistent training so that everybody has the exact same experience when they show up at the polls, and that everybody has the exact same access. And then she passed another bill which would make it easier to count and cure absentee ballots. The list goes on, but it was definitely a real step in the right direction today for New York State, and to continue to push back on a state that was previously pretty restrictive.
Thank you, Laura. And one other question. What is the state of election security in New York State?
Yeah, when looking at some of this research and looking at what were dubbed election police in other states, it really made me think about us here in New York State. And there are political actors across New York State who are working to challenge our current election process and kind of sow disinformation and misinformation about how our election system works. And we're seeing people become more and more active and kind of pushing this really false narrative. But when it gets down to brass tacks, the New York State election system works well. It works well. There are hardly ever any issues or falsifications or anything that would really need to be called out as being incorrect. There was a report a couple weeks ago that found that call them bad actors were going door to door challenging people's voter registration status. That's something the Board of Elections is never going to do. They truly don't have the time to do it. But a lot of people don't know that, right? And so if you don't know that and you're talking to someone at your door who claims to be a representative of the state, you might think, oh, maybe I'm not registered and I can't make it to the polls this November. And so it's things like that we're starting to see here in New York State that are becoming even more concerning. The League has a number of different flyers to talk about election security if anybody's interested. I'll combat some of this.
Thank you, Erica. Does anyone in the audience have any questions? You can use your electronic hand or you can put it in the chat. We're open for questions right now. Faye Paris. Thank you, Faye.
Yes, hi. Thank you. Does everyone hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay,
Yes, we
great.
can.
Just a point. First of all, thank you for having this wonderful program. This is a question to Laura Bierman. Just curious, I was really shocked about Mississippi in 1984 being the last state to ratify. And I'm wondering, what was the practical implication? How did that translate into women and their voting power in that state during that year? Thanks.
Good question. I will answer it very generally because I can't, get into too much specifics on it. I don't know the whole history of it, but what I can tell you is that on August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment was certified. It became part of our Constitution. So it didn't really matter the rest of the states. We didn't need them to ratify it. It was still applicable in every single state in the country. So it was probably more symbolic that Mississippi finally in 1984 decided, hey, maybe we should ratify the 19th Amendment, because it really didn't make any difference once, August 26, 1920 happened.
Thank you. And I guess you believe that socially it didn't impact women. Women weren't dissuaded because Mississippi hadn't ratified from a practical. You might not know the answer, but I'm
I
wondering.
don't know the answer to that. I will also tell you that I was also surprised. I don't know if any of you saw, I forget the name of the movie. Was it The Suffragists or something with Meryl Streep a few years ago, which was talked about the women's suffrage fight in England, and how women got the right to vote in England, which was a much more violent fight than it was in this country. But anyway, at the end, I watching the credits, I remember it lists the different countries in the world and when women got the right to vote in each of the different countries. And the last one on the list was Switzerland, and I believe it was 1974. And that just was so surprising to me that women did not have the right to vote. Now, maybe they were voting and it was just to get it in the books. I don't know. But I was just like, and that just stuck with me so much that women in Switzerland technically did not have the right to vote until 1974. Oh, good. Pat Nugent, I bet she has more information on this and can help me. This is her field of study. So
well, thank you. Laura and Erica, great job. I'm so proud to be a longtime league member. I'm proud of everything, the history and what it represents. So thanks. And thanks to the Bar Association for sponsoring this. I wanted to mention Alice Paul because that's the movie Iron Jawed Angels, Laura, is the one you referenced, and it's free on YouTube. It is worth holding a group of friends and watching it because it is the story of what they went through in England and what she brought back to the United States. And it strikes me that we can't talk about the history of the women's suffrage movement in this country without focusing on Alice Paul as well, because she, for me, is the one who took it over the finish line, in the sense of she got angry and decided, and Emmeline Pankhurst is the one in England who was the rabble rouser, and her slogan was deeds, not words. And as much as I'm a Susan B. Anthony fan, they very much had an intellectual approach to securing women's rights. So they spoke, they did, they did brochures, that kind of thing. Whereas Alice Paul was the one lining up the women protesting outside the White House, which is how they got the attention finally. So I'm reading a great book called Alice Paul Claiming Power. So I recommend that. But there's a quote I wanted to share, especially with Erica, because I feel like we are slowly creeping towards fascism in this country. And I used to think that was extreme, but I no longer, looking at that voter suppression data again, it's pretty dire. So I want to read this quote, and I'll put it in the chat as well, but it's short. It's that those who are outside the Constitution have no ordinary means of securing admission and therefore must try extraordinary means. And that is what drove Emmeline Pankhurst. That was her quote in England. And I think we need to start thinking about, we're not doing it logically anymore. You can't rationalize with illogical people. So the league has, from my point of view, stepped up a little bit to do more action and do more visible kinds of things. And I would encourage all of us to be brave and get out there, because it is pretty scary out there. So I thank the league for everything you're doing.
Thank you, Patricia. Thank you very much for that quote. Thank you. Does anybody else have questions? You can use your electronic hand. Christine Flores, I'm sorry. Hi, Christine. How are you? Just unmute yourself and you can speak. Thank you, Christine. Thank you.
Thank you for having this, and the struggle continues. And I think history is important because I have a feeling, and sometimes I feel that we don't contextualize history to make it personal. So I think we tend to forget that we still have to fight for things, and then we get tired. And I think it was Coretta Scott King who said that every generation has to fight for these things again, but we have to keep fighting for them. And every generation brings a new group of people because of the changing demographics of our country, and that offers challenges and opportunities. So I want to congratulate the League, Albany County, and with the National Voter Registration Day. I loved all the pictures, and I think that that's the kind of activity that really, when we have an opportunity with social media to really spread the message and share some of the joy too of doing it, right? Because the pictures were a lot of fun. Erica, I have a question for you with regards to the ERA. So I know no one is willing or can predict what the status is, and with everything that's going on, timing is everything, and it seems like the timing isn't politically right now to have published the ERA. But do you have some thoughts on the timing of this or possibilities around it, and also what kinds of pushes other than just lobbying for it you think we should be considering?
Yeah, so that's and Amy has a similar question in the chat, and it's kind of a hard question to answer because it often goes into kind of this standstill, right, where we're just waiting to see who is going to take action at the national level to bring this back up and move it forward. I would say probably someone that most of you all know who's been doing a huge push on this is former Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney. Has been doing a massive push to generate support for the amendment via a petition, which can be incredibly impactful when popped in front of a legislator's desk. And so I'll plug that petition into the chat. I know any League members on the call are like, we've seen this so many times, but you can sign on to that. And I know that there isn't too much else going on, at least on the national League level currently. As I said, it's kind of in a standstill before where that timing looks a little bit better. So unfortunately, it's kind of a non-answer for you. Sorry, Christine.
If I could just add, the national ERA, for those of you who remember back in the 70s when it was passed, and it then got extended and it got ratified by so many states. The problem is that the Congress, in their great wisdom, put a deadline as to when it had to be ratified by, and then they extended it, et cetera, et cetera. It has now received enough states that have ratified it. However, it's after the deadline. So technically it hasn't been ratified. And now some states are saying they want to pull back and say if they ratified it, that now they want to vote again and not have it be not ratify it. But anyway, there was a bill, I believe it was in the spring, and I'm sure Arlene or Pat or somebody on this call probably can correct me when
it was the spring, Laura.
Was it in the spring? Okay, thanks, Erica.
Yeah.
And to get the to Congress to extend that deadline and allow all these ratifications to count, and that did fail. The U.S. League did push hard for that, but it did not pass. So I think that's when and Carolyn Maloney, as Erica said, was a congresswoman and lost her election last year. And so now she is giving a very strong voice to see what can happen to get the national ERA done. Erica, do you want to do just a quick though about, I know you did talk about, but where the state ERA amendment is as far, and what the League is doing with that, and that the coalition, et cetera, that we're working with? When it passed and where, what the stage is and what we're hoping to do with some of it, which we're not exactly sure yet, but.
Sure. Yeah. So the just looking at Patricia's note in the chat there, the New York State Equal Rights Amendment is a constitutional amendment in New York State. So in order to be passed, all the lawyers on the call probably know this, it needs to be passed twice in two consecutive legislatures. So it was passed once in, well, the years are running together. It passed once in 2021 or 2022. And then when the legislature switched over to a new legislature, it was passed again. I suppose it was earlier this year in January of 2023. And so now what happens is the measure will move to the ballot for voters, and it will be on the ballot in 2024 so that we could get as many voters out to vote on this issue as possible, because it's a presidential election year. And so more voters will typically turn out. So the league has launched an ERA, New York State ERA task force, where we're working on this issue statewide, doing education and outreach. Well, we will be doing that. And we're also working in conjunction with the, there is a statewide ballot initiative committee that is working on this with a number, hundreds of different organizations across New York State that are all going to be working to push for the ERA, the New York State ERA. Yes, yeah. Patricia makes a good point in the chat there that this amendment still had pretty significant pushback. Amy asks, will the New York State passage of the ERA after 2024 have significant impact? And the answer is absolutely. Like yes and no. So it won't have the significant impact that you might think of. You're not going to see immediate changes in your day-to-day life, but what it does is truly enshrines protections for all of these classes that are not currently protected in the Constitution, so that if you are discriminated against while you are at work for your disability, for example, and say we had the thing is, having something enshrined in the Constitution is a lot more powerful than just having it as a law. So laws can change fairly easily. So protections around disability access, for example, could theoretically change based on whomever is in power. But having that right enshrined in our Constitution would ensure that people would be protected more easily when it came to a court decision. But I don't know if Elizabeth, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know.
Well, also, I would just like to say the big thing on the New York State ERA, which is not in the national ERA, is protection for reproductive choice and abortion rights, and that is in the New York State ERA. And we do have those protections currently in New York State by statute, by laws, as Erica was saying. So the idea is that this would enshrine it in the Constitution, which makes it harder to make change later. Changing laws is much easier than changing the Constitution. But that is a huge difference between the national ERA and the state ERA. They are not the same. They keep calling them both the ERAs, but they are not anything. They're not the same ERAs. So, yeah.
I have a question. I just saw something that was unsettling that Patricia Nugent put in the chat. And I don't know, Erica, if you can address this, but she says that 1/3 of the New York State legislators voted against bringing New York State ERA to a public vote. Was there any basis for that, those kind of numbers to stop this? Do you know if there what was said? What was the basis for it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah,
large.
And the pushback kind of varied, and some of it was theoretically what you might expect. There was some pushback from groups that said that this would give people who are pregnant outsized power to have abortions in New York State, what they referred to as quote unquote late term abortions, which is not a term it's not an accurate description of what's happening. When in fact, that's not the case at all, right? It's New York State, under the Reproductive Health Equity Act of 2019, New Yorkers already have very consistent access to abortion rights, even past the 24 weeks, if medically necessary for whatever reason, right? So New Yorkers already have access to a lot of these laws. All we would be doing is not changing laws or access, but just, again, enshrining those laws into our Constitution. There was some other pushback from groups who said, from some religious institutions, saying that they're upset that religion wasn't going to be included in this amendment. And the reason that religion wasn't going to be included is because we already have protections for religion in our Constitution. And so adding it here in this amendment may, advocates were concerned that they may give religious institutions kind of outsized power in our Constitution. And so ultimately, some concessions were made on the amendment, but we didn't add religion to the list because, again, it's already in the Constitution. So there were some pushback like that, and then some people didn't give answers. As I'm sure you can imagine, I think that 99% of that 1/3 of voters were male legislators. It kind of fell along the party lines that you might expect it to. So not a ton of surprises, but still pretty disheartening.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Erica. Okay, does anybody else have any questions for Laura and Erica? While we're getting ready to wrap it up, it's a little after 7. No questions. So I just want to thank Laura and Erica again for a wonderful program. I thank the Queens County Women's Bar Association for really seeing the importance of having this kind of program, to have this kind of discussion. And I want to thank all of you for coming out. I mean, it's really nice to see that we have so many people that are active and want to know and want to learn and want to be involved. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thank you so much to the Queens County Women's Bar Association. It's been wonderful working with you all.
Thank you. Thank you. Laura,
Um,
did you want to say something? No?
Nope, just
Okay.
thank you all. And you can get more information on all of our activities on our website, lwvny.org. Under the advocacy tab, it will have a lot of what Erica was talking about, if anyone wants more information about what the league's doing. And voting information is there as well. So thank you, Elizabeth. We appreciate your help with this project.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. We couldn't do it without you, so thank you. So with that said, have a good evening, have a safe evening, and hopefully you'll join us on the next program next year when we'll have Laura and Erica come back.
Oh,
We'd
great.
love to. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Good
Thank
night.
you, Liz. Thank you
care
so
all.
much, Liz and
Thank
Faye.
you.
Thank you. Really
Okay.
appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.